Okay, good afternoon. My name is Evan Weiner. My background is journalism. Been to Canada more. I've probably seen more of Canada than most Canadian citizens. On Saturday, it's July 1st. And on July 1st, it's Canada Day. So that's what they're going to celebrate. It will be the 156th anniversary of Canada becoming a country. And this is Vancouver, and this is July 2nd, 2017. I used to speak on cruise ships before COVID. I could still speak on cruise ships, even though there's COVID, but right now I'm not bothering with it, although I've been asked to go to Quebec City on the Atlantic Canadian run in September, but I have to be in Seattle because my daughter is giving birth to a baby, so that's where, thank you. Anyway, so that's Vancouver, and that's Port Charlottetown. And Charlottetown, Prince Edward Island, is where Canada actually starts. Now, how many of you remember reading Longfellow's Evangeline in school? Remember the forest primeval and all that? Well, most young Americans are introduced to Canada through that poem, Evangeline, which is a tale of Acadie. It's a poem by the American poet Henry Wadsworth Longfellow that was published in 1847. The poem follows an Acadian girl by the name of Evangeline in her search for her love lost, Gabriel, set during the time of the expulsion of the Acadians. Now, the expulsion of the Canadians, or the French rather, in Nova Scotia, kind of cleans it up. It was really ethnic cleansing by the English to get rid of the French. And there's Evangeline, which is a big industry in both Nova Scotia and Louisiana. There are museums, there are celebrations of this poem, and it would have been totally forgotten without Longfellow. Anyway, Evangeline. The expulsion of the Acadians was the forced removal by the British of the Acadian people from Nova Scotia, what is today Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, Prince Edward Island. And that was all known by the French, who named it as Acadia. Some of the Acadians ended up in Louisiana and formed American Cajun culture. If they were able to escape David's Island in Halifax, in the port of Halifax, now in Nova Scotia. The expulsion lasted 9 years, 1755 to 1764, occurred during the French and Indian War, a war that may have been started by George Washington. And George Washington is one of the founders of America, first president under the Constitution, first in war, first in peace, first in the hearts of his countrymen. But the truth of the matter is, with Washington, he was lousy on the battlefield. He won some, lost some, and in 1754, the British Crown sent him out to what is now Erie, Pennsylvania, to talk to the French. There was an ambush. Some people got killed. Washington was taken as prisoner of war, returned to Virginia, and he could have started this war, or one of the factors that started this war. At one time, there was 14,100 Acadians living in the Nova Scotia, Prince Edward Island, Maine area. About 11,500 Acadians were deported. This is Louisbourg. This is a facsimile fort. At one time, it was the largest fort in North America. It was built by the French in 1730. It was sacked by the British in 1758. And that is the Plains of Abraham. That's in Quebec City. And that is where some of the history of North America changes. Back in 1993, I was covering hockey for Westwood One Radio Network. And I was in Quebec City, and I had my family with me, my son, my daughter, and my wife. And my son was having, let's say, a little problem. And we're standing in front of the Hotel Chateau Frontenac. And there was a hockey player I knew who played with the New York Rangers by the name of Anders Hedberg. He was from Sweden, and he had played with the Winnipeg Jets in the World Hockey Association. and about 7 times a year he would be in Quebec City. Now he's Swedish, mind you. So he's talking to my son, and he's talking to me. He says, let's take a walk down to the Plains of Abraham, which is a big park today. And we walk, and he's telling my son, he says, you know, if things did not go the way they did, you might be speaking French right now, along with a lot of America. And this is a guy from Sweden, and he's absolutely correct. The French general Montcalm was killed in Quebec City in 1759, and the English take over Quebec City, and ever since then Canada has been a bilingual country. During the 7 Years' War, 1759, the British under the command of General James Wolfe besieged Quebec City for 3 months. The city was defended by the French general, Marquis de Montcalm. A very short battle, about 15 minutes, took place on the Plains of Abraham. This was Abraham's farm. This is his farmland that the English go on to and meet the French in this battle. And it culminated in a British victory and the surrender of Quebec and Quebec City. Now that is the, well, you can't see it all that well, but that is Chateau Frontenac, and if you take a little walk, that is the Plains of Abraham. And Quebec City is a walled city. Not completely walled, but it's a walled city. You had the lower village and you had the higher village. The higher or the upper village is where the rich people lived. That's also where Abraham had his farm. And this is when you are on the Plains of Abraham, you look down. It's about a 220-foot cliff that you have to climb. So the French figured, we'll put the wall up until here, and nobody in their right mind is going to climb these cliffs to attack us. Except they were wrong. The British came here and they climbed the cliffs, and they knew where the wall ended, and they just went right on to what is now known as the Plains of Abraham. There's a battle, Montcalm is killed, and now you have the English in Quebec City. British and French had coexisted in North America, but the threat of French expansion into the Ohio Valley caused the British to attempt to eradicate New France, which was Nova Scotia back in those days, from the map completely. The fight over the Ohio Valley was pretty simple. There were furs there, and whoever got the fur trade made a lot of money, and that's one of the reasons they went to war. And also the English hated the French, and the French hated the English, so why not wipe out New France entirely? In the battle, or the Plains of Abraham battle, Quebec City was eradicated. Quebec City was permanently lost by the French. In 1763, France formally ceded its claims to Canada, and Quebec City's French-speaking Catholic population came under the rule of the Protestant British Empire. Now, in the South, Maine is here. In those days, it was Massachusetts, part of Massachusetts. Maine is here. Nova Scotia is right there. They're separated by water, and the water is not very big. The southern colonists, the 13 colonies in the South, which would eventually become the United States, they're watching closely in the South. They know England is won in Quebec and chased the French out of Nova Scotia. England pulls its best troops. And the people in the South are getting really irate, very irate. And the reason why, they're being taxed, or they think they're being taxed without representation. And this is Boston. And for $10, you could go into this little restaurant and you can order some tea. And you can take the tea and throw it into the water and have your own little tea party. Taxation without representation. The Quebec Act, passed in 1774, allowed les Canadiens Québécois to have religious and linguistic freedoms to practice their Catholicism and use their French. Now, what was done was this. The British Crown is looking at the rebellions that are taking place, the Boston Tea Party, and other tea parties. That wasn't the only tea party. There was one in York, Massachusetts, which is now York, Maine. And they're looking and they're seeing a pattern of resistance against British rule. So they do not want the Quebecois to say, hey, wait a minute, maybe we'll get a better deal with the southern colonists, so we'll give them the chance to practice their religion and also their language, and hopefully they'll stay on our side. Well, they were going to stay on the British side anyway, regardless, because the Quebecois view the forefathers, whether it was Ben Franklin, whether it was Thomas Jefferson, and all the others, as godless hedonists, and they wanted no part of these godless hedonist people from south of the St. Lawrence River. So they were they were unhappy with the Brits, but they did not want any part of those Americans, those crazy Americans on the other side of the St. Lawrence River. The American Revolution took place 1775 to 83. The growing tensions between the residents of Great Britain's 13 North American southern colonies and the colonial government, which represented the British Crown. Now, Canada. Well, what are they thinking? There are territories. There are Upper Canada and Lower Canada. There's Nova Scotia. What are they thinking about this? Well, in Nova Scotia, they're kind of like, They're seeing that the British troops and the colonial militiamen in Lexington and Concord, Massachusetts, have begun to fight in April of 1775, and that the rebels, the Southern rebels, Southern colonialist rebels, were waging a full-scale war for their independence. Hello, France. France enters the American Revolution on the side of the colonists in 1778, turning what had been essentially a civil war, rich people not wanting to pay taxes to the Brits, wanting to get out, and this civil war becomes an international conflict in a hurry. That's the Liberty Bell in Philadelphia. Nova Scotia. Nova Scotia is right across the river, or the water, from Massachusetts. And they're thinking, because it's basically the same people, because, well, England had carved up the territory, and they're the ones who said, this is Massachusetts, this is Nova Scotia. So Nova Scotia's in a dither. Should we join the southern colonists in defiance of Britain? And there were some battles in what is now Canada, the Battle of Fort Cumberland in Nova Scotia and the Siege of St. John. That was in 1776 and 1777. Well, Nova Scotia is on the fence. Should we or shouldn't we? Should we or shouldn't we? Should we or shouldn't we? Well, eventually they say no. George Washington had a chance to take Nova Scotia on the silver platter. Here, it's right here, take it. But he didn't think it was worth the time and effort or the money for ammunition. So he says no. But a number of Nova Scotians said, you know, we're going to get involved in this. We think this is a good cause. But there was a lot of double dirty dealing and a lot of double crossing by both sides. And eventually the Nova Scotians said, we're going to stick with the Brits. And British military forces based in Halifax succeeded in preventing American support for the rebels in Nova Scotia. So Nova Scotia stays, and the people there are very unhappy. While the British captured many American privateers in battles, such as the naval battle off Halifax in 1782, many more continued attacks on shipping and settlements until the final months of the war. The Americans beat England in Yorktown, Virginia in 1781. The war is just about done, and England goes back to fighting France. This is the Treaty of Paris, which is signed on September 3rd, 1783 in Paris. And British negotiators and American negotiators signed the treaty, ceasing hostilities and recognizing Americans' independence. And there are people in Nova Scotia trying to figure out, did we do the right thing or didn't we do the right thing? Did we do the right thing or not? The English controlled Nova Scotia, and then what they did in Nova Scotia was take Nova Scotia and cut off a piece of it, and that became New Brunswick. The reason why they cut off a piece of it is in the United States of America now, no longer the 13 colonies, there were people who supported the crown. And a lot of them felt that they had to flee. And they were going to get safe haven in New Brunswick, land taken from Nova Scotia. St. John in New Brunswick became Canada's, Canada in quotation marks because it wasn't Canada, first incorporated city. Oh, Benedict Arnold, hero or traitor? What do you think? Is Benedict Arnold a hero or was he a traitor? I guess it depends what side of the river you're on. He is a traitor in America, but this is St. John, New Brunswick, and there is a statue of Benedict Arnold, who is recognized as a Canadian hero, even though he never, ever lived in Canada. And to boot, he invaded Quebec City back in the early days of the war, thinking he could take Quebec City, except he did it in December. He didn't realize how cold it could be in December in Quebec City. Well, needless to say, Benedict Arnold did not win the Battle of Quebec City. But Benedict Arnold ended up in New Brunswick in St. John in 1785 with his son Richard. And he speculated in land and established a business doing trade with the West Indies. Benedict Arnold purchased large tracts of land and acquired lots in St. John and Fredericton. But the family was forced to leave St. John, gone in December of 1791. The reason why? Dirty dealing, double crossing people. He was disliked because of bad business deals and petty lawsuits. And with that, Benedict Arnold flees to England because the local people hated him. But now he has a statue. He's got a statue in St. John. The War of 1812 comes around, the Americans against the Brits. And if you ask people in Canada who won the War of 1812, they say, we did. Ask Americans and they say, what? Well, the reason that the Canadians think that they won the War of 1812 is pretty simple. The Americans never invaded after 1812, which is kind of true, but kind of not true. But anyway, in June 1812, the United States declared war against Great Britain in reaction to three issues: the British economic blockade of France, the impressment of thousands of neutral American seamen into the British Royal Navy against their will, and the British support of hostile Indian tribes along the Great Lakes frontier. That's where the fur is, and that's where you can make some money, and there was support from some of the Indian tribes for the Brits along the Great Lakes frontier. So, it's 1812. 36-year-old America decides to declare war against Great Britain for a second time. There was a plan now. Conquer all of British North America, or what now is Canada, and take North America for the United States once and for all. Well, not quite. Mexico is, Spain is controlling what became Mexico, and there's all that territory that would eventually become Texas, California, New Mexico, Utah, that they had to have a fight with Spain over, but it never happened. Faction in the U.S. Congress made up mostly of Western and Southern congressmen. West is Kentucky, West is Tennessee, South is Tennessee, were advocating the declaration of war for several years. The White House is burned down in 1814. Now, it's called the Executive Mansion in those days. And the reason it's called the White House now is that they painted it white to cover up all the burn marks. The Federalists, especially New Englanders who relied heavily on trade with Britain, accused the war advocates, or the hawks, of using the excuse of maritime rights to promote their expansionist agenda. They want to leave well enough alone. Most of the war fought around the Great Lakes, like in Mackinac Island, and that's another thing where there's a wall, or was a wall around the fort, except for the back of the fort. That's where the British just walked in and took over the fort, Mackinac Island. That's where most of the fighting took place. In the months following the U.S. declaration of war, American forces launched a three-point invasion of British North America, or Canada, all of which were repulsed. At sea, however, the United States was more successful, and at that time, the British Navy was the strongest navy in the world. The USS Constitution and other American frigates won a series of victories over British warships, but that would change. In 1813, American forces won several key victories in the Great Lakes region, but Britain regained control of the sea and blocked the eastern seaboard. Now, this guy is a big hero in Canada. His name is General Robert Ross, even though he never lived in Canada. He was a British general, and he's the guy who burnt down the White House. He gave the orders to burn down the White House, and there is the White House. It's 1814, and Washington, D.C. fell to the British in August. British troops burned the White House, the Capitol, and other buildings in retaliation for the earlier burning of government buildings in what is now Ontario, near Toronto, now the city of Toronto, by U.S. soldiers. But they stopped at Fort William McKendree. Fort William McKendree in Baltimore. Ross is going, it's about a 40-mile trip between Washington, D.C. and Baltimore. He may have made the same progress in getting up there as you would today on the Baltimore-Washington Road, or 95. But he gets up to there, and there's a huge bombardment of Fort William McKendree. But the Brits would soon retreat right afterwards. And there was a guy by the name of Francis Scott Key. Ever hear of Francis Scott Key? Yeah, well, he's watching all of this. And he's looking at this, and he penned something, a poem called The Star-Spangled Banner, which in 1931 became the United States national anthem. One thing you can see here, that United States history is intertwined with Canadian history. Big time intertwining. On September 11th, 1814, the tide of war turned when an American naval force under Thomas MacDonald won a decisive victory at the Battle of Plattsburgh in New York on Lake Champlain. A large British army under Sir George Prevost was forced to abandon its invasion of the U.S. Northeast and retreat to British North America or Canada, somewhere near Montreal. Well, this is a statue of Albert Gallatin in Washington, D.C., and he's the U.S. envoy that would end the War of 1812. December 24th, 1814, there's an agreement. It's back to the 1812 borders. Britain gives up American land near the border and the Great Lakes. U.S. gives up Ontario. And for the second time in about, let's say, since 1783, second time in 31 years, Spain gets back Florida. Spain gets Florida. But the United States is eyeing Florida and would get it within 5 years. President James Madison signs the agreement on February 17, 1815. But nobody told this guy that the war was over. You might recognize him from the $20 bill, Andrew Jackson, President of the United States. General Andrew Jackson. Old Hickory said we could take him by surprise. News of the treaty took almost 2 months to cross the Atlantic, and British forces were not informed of the end of the hostilities in time to end their drive against the mouth of the Mississippi River. It's January 8, 1815, and there's a large British army that is attacking New Orleans, and they're decimated by the inferior American force under General Andrew Jackson in the most spectacular victory of the world and war, except there's a problem. The war was over. So it was a waste of a battle. But it wasn't all that bad. It wasn't all that bad, because in 1959, you see this guy, Johnny Horton, 1959, he had a big hit called The Battle of New Orleans. 1814, we took a little trip. Remember that song? Took a little down the Mississippi, right? So it took all those years later, right? It took about 145 years later, or whatever it was, except he had the #1 song. And his next song was North to Alaska, Johnny Horton. So who won? Who won? This is a graveyard in Halifax. And basically it says, well, this is why we're not Americans. Except they really don't go into detail as to why we are not Americans. There's some smattering here. We are not Americans because of the service of men like the sailors and soldiers, casualties of the War of 1812, buried in this historic burying ground. They fought and died at sea and ashore to prevent the United States invasion and annexation of our country, except the United States did invade. They did invade. They went to Ontario. And it was a waste of war. It's a total waste of war, but that's the reason. So if you ask Canadians, who won the War of 1812, they say, we did. Well, why? Well, you never invaded us again. Okay, but we kind of did, almost. In fact, yeah, we kind of did. The War of 1812 was the last major confrontation between England and America, ends in 1815, but not all territorial disputes were settled. Canadians and Native Americans saw the war as a decisive turning point in their losing struggle to govern themselves. Eventually, Canadians would go to Prince Edward Island and discuss their destiny. But all is not well after the War of 1812. There were rebellions, and you can see there are two guys hanging there. During the rebellions of 1837 and 1838, and this is it's about 58 years since the start of the American Revolution, in Upper and Lower Canada, and hundreds of armed citizens rose up against the government, protesting the injustices of the ruling elite and demanding changes in politics and economics of imperial rule in British North America. In Nova Scotia, they're beginning to think, you know, we made a mistake about 60 years ago. We should have gone with the southern colonists. Quebec, they're trying to figure out what should we have done, because this is not good. We got to get out of the British rule. The revolt in Lower Canada was more serious and violent than the rebellion in Upper Canada. Lord Durham comes over to North America in 1839 and has this report that he's prepared after being on the ground about why the people in Nova Scotia and Quebec are really upset, why Nova Scotia is having second thoughts about not jumping over to America. In 1838, Lord Durham was a British politician, and he goes to British North America, which is Nova Scotia, Quebec, and Ontario. And he's looking, why were there rebellions in 1737 and 38 in the colonies? Durham's report on the affairs of British North America led to a series of reforms and changes. Those including uniting the two Canadas into one single colony, the province of Canada, in 1841. And he proposed the creation of municipal governments in the Supreme Court in the British North American colonies. He also wanted to resolve the land question in Prince Edward Island. His long-held plan for the union of all British North American colonies was dropped because Nova Scotia and New Brunswick, and remember New Brunswick came out of Nova Scotia, they're uninterested. And they've had second thoughts about not joining the Americans. But they weren't going to join the Americans at this point. Durham proposed all of this. And in Quebec, there's something else. And there is Montcalm, there is Wolfe, their statues are carved into the Quebec City Parliament building where the provincial government meets. Durham believed that the problems in mostly French Lower Canada were ethnic in nature, not political. He found two nations warring in the bosom of a single nation. Durham was culturally biased against French Canadians. He called them a people with no literature and no history. He recommended assimilating them by uniting the Canadas in a way that would allow the English-speaking majority in Upper Canada to dominate. Durham's report was condemned by Upper Canada's Tory elite. Reformers in Upper Canada and in Nova Scotia hailed the idea of responsible government, and Nova Scotia was going to do something about it. But there's also another problem in 1839, and America and Britain are on the brink of war. Did you know that? They ever teach you that in school? They really don't. They kind of fluff over it. Anyway, that's my wife in front of St. John's City Hall. New Brunswick is the only province in Canada where both English and French are the official language. Quebec is French, the rest of Canada it's English. There was a boundary dispute because they didn't know the precise boundary between Maine and New Brunswick. And since the American Revolution, it was a point of contention for years and years and years. And now you're talking about, since the end of the Revolution, at this point, you're talking about 56 years. The dispute festered, smoldered until 1839, when it threatened to erupt in open warfare. The Maine legislature raised funds to support 10,000 military people to protect the state's border claims at Madawaska. Several hundred British regulars were dispatched to the scene from Quebec. At this point, the U.S. Congress entered the picture, proving $10 million for military expenses should a war break out. Nearly 50,000 troops were ready for action, and Major General Winfield Scott was dispatched to the scene. Scott managed to work out a temporary agreement between the two parties before the so-called War of Aroostook reached the point of bloodshed. So the Americans and the Brits are about ready to go to war again. And this one, 54-40 or fight. This is Alaska. And the Americans are thinking about, let's get all of the land, which is now British Columbia, let's take all of that land up to the Russian-Alaska border. It's ours. Manifest destiny. We should have it. So 54-40 or fight. In 1818, the United States and Great Britain established a joint claim over the Oregon Territory, region west of the Rocky Mountains, between 42 North, the boundary of what was then Spain's Alta California, it would become Mexico within 2 years, and 54-40 North, the southern boundary of Russia's Alaska Territory. By the 1840s, the joint control had broken down, and the expansionist Democrats, including the 1844 presidential candidate James K. Polk, claimed the entire territory for the United States. He said it was ours. Well, it really wasn't, but he said it was ours. The expansion design was expressed by Polk's famous campaign slogan, 54-40 or fight. Slogan became an early cry of the settlers in the territory. The popular phrase was picked up from Senator William Allen of Ohio, who coined the expression in an 1844 speech on the Senate floor. The dispute was settled in 1846. Keep Portland weird. Portland, Oregon. Well, Portland, Oregon was part of the British territory. The Ashburton-Webster Treaty, or the Webster-Ashburton Treaty of 1842, partially delineated the northeastern U.S., British, North America, or Canada border, but the Oregon Territory was left unsettled. See, the Brits said, okay, we'll give up that California land, but we're going to stay right there, which is the Columbia River. That's Astoria, Oregon. The United States didn't want any part of that. That was one part of the negotiation. Oregon Territory existed from August 14, 1848 till February 14, 1859, when the southwestern portion of the territory was admitted to the Union as the state of Oregon. Territory divided between the UK and the US, 1846, and the states carved out of it, Oregon, Washington, Idaho, Wyoming, and Montana. The British part would be British Columbia. And that's Windsor, Ontario, south of Detroit. That's Detroit looking south. South is Windsor, Ontario. It's one of it's technically the only city south of the United States, but if you look at the map and you look in the east, Toronto is south of the United States-Canadian border, among others. Nova Scotia became the first colony in the British North American Crown to achieve government status, self-governing status, February 1948, through the efforts of Joseph Howe. Nova Scotia established representative government officially in 1858. And that is the island that the French went to. If you survived that island, David's Island, if you survived it, chances are that you were going to go on the boat. And if you survive that, chances are that you're going to end up in Louisiana or somewhere else alive. But the odds of you staying alive weren't very big. Anyway, that's the Halifax port, and that is the Citadel, which protected Halifax from any sort of, it's about a mile from the port, so any sort of attack, the soldiers would come from there. 1857, it was decided that the province of Canada was in need of a permanent seat of government, capital. For 15 years, the government had moved from one place to another: Kingston, Ontario, 1841, Montreal, 1844, Toronto, 1849, Quebec City, 1855. Well, Kingston is right on the other side of what is now Route 81. And you go right over to the Canadian side, St. Lawrence Seaway, there's Kingston. The name is named after the king, and the Brits said, you know what, I think we better not put the capital there, too close to the United States. But by the 1850s, someone thought it was a good idea to have a capital, and Quebec City, Montreal, and Kingston were in the running. Montreal, too French, not going to Montreal. Quebec City, also too French. New Year's Eve, 1857, Queen Victoria, as a symbolic and political gesture, was presented with the responsibility of selecting a location for the permanent capital of the province of Canada. But she really didn't do it. It was Prime Minister John A. Macdonald, and he tells the executive branch of the government, this is what we're going to go to. We are going to go to this place called Ontario.
Get out of here.
Ontario is halfway between Quebec City and Toronto. And there is a strategic reason that it was placed in Ottawa. The Queen's choice was the small frontier town, Ottawa. It used to be called Bytown. It used to be filled with prostitutes and drunks. They cleaned it up. But one of the advantages that Ottawa had was 40 miles away from the St. Lawrence River and across from the United States. Dense forest. It was all forest. Today it's all roads and housing and all. It's dense forest. Filled with malaria. Absolutely filled with malaria. So the feeling was that the Americans are not going to risk getting malaria. So if we put it here, it's going to take them a long time to go around, whether it's Toronto or Montreal or York in those days. And it's on a cliff. And it would be really more defensible from attack. And you can see there's Parliament Hill, and it's high up. It is really high up. Ottawa was approximately midway between Toronto and Kingston in what was Canada's west, and Montreal and Quebec City in Canada's east. Nova Scotia is on its own by this point, but the others are controlled by Great Britain. Ottawa becomes the capital. Oh, did you ever know about the Pig War? There's another war between the United States and Great Britain, or almost war. Well, my wife is, we're on a ferry there, and that's the San Juan Islands. And the San Juan Islands were kind of disputed after they came up with a 49 parallel solution. But some of them were actually shared by Britain and the United States. Well, the wording of the Oregon Treaty was vague when it came to the channel which separates the continent from Vancouver Island. There are several navigable waterways between Vancouver Island and the mainland, and the ownership of the San Juan Islands remained contested. 1859, a pig wandered over from the British-Canadian side to the American side and was found in an American settler's garden. The pig was shot. I don't know if he was eaten that night, but the pig was shot or she was shot. And the British said, hey, we want compensation. American troops were sent to occupy the island while British warships patrolled offshore. There were a few skirmishes over the 13 years before the dispute was settled. It was called the Pig War. That is Prince Edward Island. That's Confederate Hall. That's the equivalent to Independence Hall in the United States in Philadelphia. In September 1846, Prince Edward Island hosted the Charlottetown Conference, which was the first meeting in the process leading to the Quebec resolutions and the creation of Canada in 1867. The Alaska problem. Well, it was a problem for the British North American population. The United States buys Alaska. Sitka, where I am there, was the last capital of Russia, Alaska. The Alaska Purchase forced the British colonists to form a country 3 months after the Alaska Purchase. Russia sold Alaska to the US government, so Britain couldn't get it. Russia needed the $7.2 million. The Tsar needed the money, 2 cents an acre. For the northern colonists, they began speaking of their own country in 1839 after the rebellions. Soon after the American Civil War, pro-Canadian Confederation Premier Charles Tupper led Nova Scotia into the Canadian Confederation on July 1st, 1867, along with New Brunswick and the province of Canada. Niagara Falls was part of it. They're part of Canada. Well, at least that part's part of Canada. That part's part of the United States. Niagara Falls, Ontario. Political deadlock. One of the reasons that the locals felt they had to leave from the current political structure. Demographic pressure. Population's expanding. Economic nationalism and the promise of economic development. And they wanted an intercontinental railroad because there was that territory on the Pacific coast which they wanted to reach. It would be good to improve trade, military movement, and transportation in general. There was also more, the cancellation of the Canadian-American Reciprocity Treaty, free trade policy whereby products were allowed into the United States without taxes or tariffs starting in 1854, which was considered beneficial for the people living in what is now Canada. 1865 by the United States, partly as revenge against Great Britain for unofficial support of the South in the American Civil War. Those are 2 John Hamilton Grays. John Hamilton Gray, meet John Hamilton Gray. They are in Prince Edward Island. The possible threat of invasion from the US increased by the Alaska Purchase of 1867, which was supported on the floor of the US Senate by Charles Sumner, among others, precisely in terms of taking over the remainder of North America from the British. And Seward, this is a plaque in Juneau, Alaska, talking about the Alaska Purchase. Juneau is the capital of Alaska. There was more. Fenian Raids, an Irish Republican organization based in the United States, in Maine, started attacking British forts in Nova Scotia and New Brunswick, custom posts and other targets in Canada in 1866. They were worried about that. The Little Englander philosophy, whereby Britain no longer wanted to maintain troops in the colonies. Political pressure from British financiers who invested money in the money-losing Grand Trunk Railway. Vancouver, British Columbia. America surrounded the British colonial territory. Northwest border was now Alaska. South was the 49th parallel. Canada starts in the east, and then looking west, and there's Maine. So they felt pressure. In 1867, there were 3 options. Stay as a British colony, be annexed by the United States, or to confederate with the newly formed Dominion of Canada. In Britain, some hoped that the North American colonies would depart from the British Empire. This is long after the American Revolution, about 90 years later, and they're finally hoping to get rid of the Canadians. But there's something really strange that takes place here. About Alabama. The state of Alabama is totally involved in something, which is kind of weird. Ships and demands. Well, the Americans want the Pacific Northwest. The Alabama claims were a series of demands for damages sought by the government of the United States from the United Kingdom in 1869 for attacks upon Union merchant ships by Confederate Navy commerce raiders, built in British shipyards during the American Civil War. America wants that territory. That's right outside of Vancouver, by the way. They want that territory. Nice looking place, isn't it? So that's what the Americans want. And the American Secretary of State, William H. Seward, who negotiated the Alaska Purchase with the Russians in 1867, that was intended as the first step in a comprehensive plan to gain control of the entire Pacific coast. Seward expected British Columbia to seek annexation to the United States and thought that Britain might accept this in exchange for the Alabama claims. Except the British Columbians didn't want to join the Americans because they couldn't stand the Americans. They were drunks, they were loud, they were obnoxious, and they wanted to build a fence to keep the Americans out. They never did build the fence, but they wanted to keep them out. That is Victoria, British Columbia, one of the early buildings in Victoria. London continued to stall about maybe, selling British Columbia or being invaded. Anyway, in America, the commercial and financial groups pressed Washington to get the money. We want the money. There was growing Canadian nationalism in British Columbia. Let's stay inside the British Empire. Congress became preoccupied with Reconstruction, and the Americans really didn't want what they thought was a lot of wasteland in the north, so that was the end of that. And Seward loses that, but he says, okay, let's form an alliance. This is Stevensonville outside of Vancouver. 1869, he visited Victoria and proposed an alliance between Alaska, British Columbia, Washington, Oregon, and California, and that's what you have today. And the railroad played a big part in British Columbia becoming part of Canada. A delegation sent to Ottawa to present British Columbia's demands for Canada or to Canada. The demands included a call for responsible government, economic aid, debt concessions, and the construction of a major transportation leak. The railroad would eventually come to BC and joined in 1781. Canada is a very, very large country. It goes from the Pacific to the Atlantic, to the Arctic Circle. It's right near Greenland, and of course it's the border with the United States. Like I said, here's Ottawa, and Ottawa is north of some of Canada, right there, or Maine. Canada has 11 provinces, 2 territories, Atlantic to the Pacific. It is 3.85 million square miles, second biggest country in the world. Canada's southern border with the United States is 5,525 miles. It's the longest binational land border. That is Chicoutimi up in Quebec. That is October. It's cold.
Can I get out of here?
I can't help you. I can't help you. The provinces are Alberta, British Columbia, Manitoba, New Brunswick, Newfoundland, Northwest Territories, Nova Scotia.
Oh my God.
None of it. Ontario, Prince Edward Island, Quebec, Saskatchewan, and the Yukon. Yukon's a territory, as is the Northwest Territories, the rest of the provinces. And there's the map, and there's Maine, and there's the St. Lawrence Seaway, and that's Eastern Canada. The Atlantic provinces are mostly dependent on the seas for their livelihoods. The Vikings allegedly discovered North America, although the area was populated at that point. Newfoundland, St. Anthony's, that's where ruins of the Vikings have been found. The thought is they came around the year 1000. John Cabot, a Venetian sailing for Britain, claimed the land in 1497. The confirmed Viking site on the American continent is L'Anse aux Meadows. It's a 1,000-year-old station, way station, discovered in 1960 at the northern tip of Newfoundland. The Newfies, all those houses are painted different colors. So when you go to the main street in St. John, you You see a pink house, green house, yellow house, red house, all in the same block. It's a good place to take some marijuana, I've been told, by locals. The Dominion of Newfoundland was a country. It was actually a country in eastern North America. Established on September 26, 1907. Depression came and it ruined the country. British Parliament passed the Newfoundland Act, 1933, after Newfoundland went broke. 1934, Newfoundland became the only Dominion to give up its self-governing status, which ended 79 years of self-government. On July 22nd, 1948, Newfoundlanders went to the polls to decide if they wanted to be part of the Confederation or remain Dominion status. By a vote of 52-48, let's join the Confederation. And they did join Canada March 31st, 1949.
And they became famous on Broadway.
Yeah. Radio starts in St. John's, Newfoundland. Marconi is up on that hill on December 12th, 1901, and the first transatlantic wireless transmission from Cornwall, UK to St. John's, Newfoundland takes place December 12th, 1901. Marconi placed his receiver on Signal Hill, nearly the closest point to Europe and North America, a distance of 2,100 miles. Marconi picked up the signal. And there is Prince Edward Island. There's the Big Island, there's some smaller islands. It's one of the 3 maritime provinces, the smallest province in land area and population. It hosted the first Canada Conference, or the Quebec Conference, but didn't join in 1867. Stayed a British colony. PEI officials met with American counterparts in 1868. They say, hey, Andrew Johnson, we want to be part of America. But they really didn't have the power to negotiate with America because they were part of the British Crown. PEI would join the Confederation in 1873 as the 7th Canadian province, and it produces 25% of Canada's potatoes, or potatoes since they're English. That's the Yukon from Atlantic to the Pacific. The Klondike Gold Rush, often called the Yukon Gold Rush, was a mass exodus of prospecting migrants from their hometowns to Canadian Yukon Territory and Alaska after gold was discovered there in 1896. For Seattle, and again, so much of the United States and Canada's history are intertwined. The Gold Rush, because it was one of the last stops you could get equipment. The Gold Rush created a boom that attracted people from all over the world after the Gold Rush ended. The idea of striking it rich led to about 100,000 people from all walks of life to abandon their houses and embark on an extended, life-threatening journey across treacherous, icy valleys and harrowing, rocky terrain. There is the Yukon, and there are things on the side of the road which you really can't see here that will measure up to like 18 feet of snow on that road, so you know how much snow there is. Dawson City turned into an American-style frontier town, complete with dance halls, theaters, saloons, brothels. Well, the men outnumbered the women 25-1, so prostitution was tolerated. By the summer of 1899, there were rumors about another gold rush in Nome, Alaska. Within a week and a half, Dawson is empty. The Klondike Gold Rush had run its course. The influx of people to Dawson turned it into a legitimate city. It led to a population boom in the Yukon Territory, Alberta, British Columbia, and Vancouver. And believe it or not, it is credited for helping the United States get out of the 1893 panic or the Depression of 1893. Again, near St. John's, Newfoundland. New Brunswick, PEI, Nova Scotia, Newfoundland, Labrador form Atlantic Canada. It's less wealthy than the rest of Canada. Fishing is a major livelihood. Oil has been discovered off of Nova Scotia. Newfoundland, Labrador became one in 1927. That is St. John's, New Brunswick. First settlement in New Brunswick and Nova Scotia. 1604, France claimed the land, which was Acadia. In 1713, Great Britain gets the land. Acadians are exiled. In 1755, the First Nation, Carrick, would eventually be the site of the return in 1758. St. John's, New Brunswick became the first incorporated city in Canada, 1785, with the Loyalists fleeing the U.S. And Louis B. Mayer, his family came over during the immigration. There were two spots that you could immigrate to from Eastern Europe in Canada. One was Halifax, the other New Brunswick, and Boston, along with New York. And Louis B. Mayer has supported that synagogue through life and through afterlife. His trust donates to keep that synagogue going.
God bless the movies.
Yeah, and there are 8 families that are still members of that. I know because I donate to them, and that's about it. Left in St. John, and there was St. John. Halifax, St. John, first entry place in Canada for immigrants. Canada did not place quotas on immigration until 1933, 9 years after the Reed-Johnson Act in the United States imposed the immigration quota. So, and there is St. John's again, and there is Halifax, there is Quebec City, there is Ottawa, there is Montreal. First Nations, Native Americans, their history is awful, absolutely awful. On July 25th, 2022, Pope Francis apologized to Canada's Native people on their land for the Church's role in schools where Indigenous children were abused, called for their forced assimilation into the culture, a deplorable evil and a disastrous error. Pope Francis was sorry for Christian support of the colonizing mentality of the times and called for a serious investigation of the schools to help survivors and descendants heal. Toronto on a foggy September day. And there's the Soo and the International Bridge, one of the most important bridges in North America. As part of New France, the area was ceded to Britain in 1793. 1783, the Northwest Company founded a trading post there and built a small lock, completed in 1797 and 98 to handle canoes, small boats for trading purposes. The lock destroyed by U.S. troops, War of 1812, rebuilt as a historic site in the late 19th century. And there is the bridge going over the St. Mary's River. The Soo is the busiest lock system in the world by cargo tonnage, all between the U.S. and Canada. 7,000 and 10,000 ships come through the locks during the shipping season. Built in 1855, the locks connect Lake Superior to Lake Huron. And there is the bridge. The Sault Ste. Marie International Bridge spans the St. Mary's River between the United States and Canada, connecting the twin cities of Sault Ste. Marie, Michigan and Sault Ste. Marie, Ontario. 10th busiest passenger crossing in the United States border, only land crossing for about 700 miles. There is Alberta in the west, and there is the Alberta-Montana border, which doesn't have a real border. It's a little fence designed to keep cattle on their side of the property. Oh, Fay Ray in King Kong. There is a Fay Ray memorial. She came from Karsten, Alberta, and there is King Kong, and there is me, Fay Ray. King Kong is holding Fay Ray. There you go, from 1933. That's a Vancouver sunrise, and that's Victoria, and you can, at 4 o'clock every day, go to the Empress Hotel and get yourself some tea in Victoria. Oh, hockey's a big deal. That's when I was in a charity game down in Greenwich with Gordie Howe. And Tim Hortons, great hockey player, better known for his donuts. In Canada, you go to Timmy's and get your donuts. The birthplace of Canada is this place in Prince Edward Island in Charlottetown. Canada entered World War I in 1914 when England got involved. Canada entered World War II in 1939 when England got involved. 1931, Canada achieved near independence from the United Kingdom with the Statute of Westminster. 1931, And full sovereignty was attained with the Canada Act in 1982, which removed the last remaining ties of legal dependence on the Parliament of the United Kingdom. Canada is a federal parliamentary democracy and a constitutional monarchy, with King Charles III the head of state. The country is bilingual at the federal level. And the Queen was very well liked. You see a lot of statues around Canada of Queen Elizabeth and paintings and all that other stuff. King Charles III is the ceremonial head of state, appoints his representative to each province. And there's a bust of Queen Elizabeth in Charlottetown. July 1st is the national holiday, but in Quebec, Saint Jean Baptiste Day is a bigger event. It takes place on June 24th every year. René Lévesque tried to separate Quebec from the rest of Canada. The separatist movement started in the 1950s and was dropped by the party in the 1980s. They never did get separation. There's special status for Quebec residents. 60% of the Quebec voting republic in the 1980s republic rejected the idea of separation. That's the flag of Quebec. 1995, after two failed attempts by the Prime Minister Brian Mulroney's government to secure Quebecois' ratification of amendments to the Constitution, the Parti Québécois held a second referendum whether or not they wanted to leave or not. That lost 50.58 to 49.42, and right now, not too many people talk about separation. And these are the massive stone walls that protect Quebec City, as you can see. Alexander Graham Bell invented the telephone in Nova Scotia. While living in Nova Scotia, Bell was working on harmonic telegraph, a device that allowed multi-messages to be transmitted over a wire at the same time. While trying to perfect this technology, backed with a group of investors, he proceeded to look for a way to find how to transmit human voice over wires. He did. That's Hastings-on-the-Hudson. Bell, who was born in Scotland, raised in Cape Breton, a lot of Gaelic spoken in Cape Breton, worked on his inventions both in the United States and Nova Scotia. March 7, 1876, Bell was granted U.S. patent 1744-65A because he got speech over a wire. In Boston, the first telephone call was made March 10, 1876. First words, "Mr. Watson, come here. I want to see you." Must have been important. He made a phone call. That is a national site in Canada. That is the Bell House. He died in Cape Breton at the age of 75, August 2nd, 1912. And guess what? Alexander Graham Bell never had a phone in his study. Didn't want to be bothered by phone calls while he was working. The Titanic, that's the Titanic grave site. There's a museum there. It has some of the artifacts that were salvaged. It's my old Grundig radio, because American radio's idea is formed in Halifax. David Sarnoff, 1912, managed the Marconi wireless station at the Wanamaker's department store in New York City. On the evening of April 14, 1912, the ocean liner Titanic struck an iceberg, started taking on water. You know the rest of the story. But Sarnoff is there, and he's getting the SOS signals in. And he's beginning to realize, hey, wait a minute, I can commercialize this eventually. So he gets flooded with the news of the disaster. He goes out to Coney Island, and he this is 3 days later, he contacts the Carpathia, which is a ship that picked up survivors that was returning to New York. He gets all the names of the passengers and forwards the news that they survived to the families. And then he comes up with the idea of radio. I'm not going to get into the technical aspects of all this, but the government gives private people a piece of the spectrum, and David Sarnoff uses it to start radio. Eventually, Sarnoff would hook up with the Radio Corporation of America, RCA, and form this, NBC Radio. Sinking of the Titanic brought radio into the public spotlight and promised U.S. Congress to regulate the medium for the first time. Sarnoff would refer to this incident as an important turning point in his career. The Titanic disaster brought radio to the front, and incidentally me. I don't know how many of you have ever heard of the harbor explosion on December 6, 1917 in Halifax, which was at that time the world's largest man-made explosion. The French munition ship collided with the steamer. The Mont Blanc blew up with 2,000 casualties, leveling parts of the city. Boston sent aid, and to this day receives an annual Christmas tree as thanks for helping out in the Halifax explosion. And that's what it looked like. 1,600 people were killed instantly, and 9,000 were injured, more than 300 of whom later died. Every building within a 1.6-mile radius, or 12,000 in total, destroyed or badly damaged. And that is the memorial, which was rededicated on the 100th anniversary in December of 1970. Hundreds of people watched the fire from their homes. They were blinded when the blast wave shattered the windows in front of them. That is the neighborhood today. It is reinforced. Well, if you compare this explosion to other explosions, like the Halifax historian Jay White did in 1914, he said if you take these 5 criteria together, that this blast remains unchallenged. And he said number of casualties, force of the blast, radius of devastation, quantity of explosive material, total value of the property destroyed. Many years, that was the gold standard. In fact, Time magazine wrote that the explosive power of the little boy bomb, atomic bombing of Hiroshima, was 7 times that of the Halifax explosion. Portland to Halifax ferry, Iranian hostages, the crisis, Canada helped the United States. January 29, 1980, CIA and the Canadian government conducted a successful undercover operation to evacuate 6 of the American hostages who had found refuge with Canadian diplomats in Tehran during the early months of the crisis. And space, that's the Canadian arm, or Canada arm, Space Buddy. Canadian Space Agency is the National Space Agency in Canada, established in 1990 with the Canadian Space Agency Act, and they work closely with NASA, so closely that this guy on the right, he's going to circle the moon next year. On April 3rd, 2023, NASA and the Canadian Space Agency announced 4 astronauts who will venture around the moon on the Artemis 2. The astronauts will be Christian Hammock-Koch, Reed Wiseman, Victor Glover, and Canadian Space Agency astronaut Jeremy Hansen. That flight will take place next year. Well, the United States and Canada, there have been squabbles over labor and fish, but they have a joint defense pact, which where the operations take place in Colorado Springs. NORAD is a bi-national command centralizing operational control of continental air defenses, and that was initially against Soviet bombers in September of '57. And they tracked this guy, and he's even wearing a mask because he's in the middle of COVID. NORAD tracks Santa Claus. May 12, 1958, the agreement was formalized. There were 11 principles governing the organization, and every 10 years they have to renew the agreement. And it's okay to be a Canuck, even when you're not a Canuck, like Richard Ross, who burnt down the White House. Thank you so much. Any questions, any comments? It's your turn to talk.
And Stephen Colbert, God bless him.
Stephen Colbert was from South Carolina.